All right, let's get real. Chances are choosing a business entity type was not on your mind as you were thinking about getting into the business. Well, let's cover it today because it's really important to go through a process to work with an attorney to choose the right business entity type. Now, I always recommend that you choose a great business attorney in your local area who understands the rules, regulations, and laws of the state because a lot of this is very state by state. Now, in the bonus section, I've got a video from my business attorney, Larry Jacobs, who goes into some of this detail. It's very interesting. I encourage you to take a look at it. And make sure you've got a great tax advisor on the team here because that can make a difference too. All right, so let's take a look and see what we're dealing with here briefly, and it'll give you some direction on where to go. So when you started, you probably started as a sole proprietor, right? A sole proprietor is simply someone without an entity. And in sole proprietorship, the challenge here is everything is on you, right? All of your business liabilities and assets, it all flows to you personally. There's no legal protection here through any sort of entity because you have none in sole proprietorship. So we recommend you get out of sole proprietorship relatively quickly. Now, if you're thinking that this business you started is going to be more of a hobby and you don't want to go through all the rules, regulations, and so forth to form an entity, okay, they'll still recommend that you check with an attorney and see if you should be staying in sole proprietorship. Most likely, he or she will say, no, we've got to put you into an entity. And one of the simplest things to do, entity-wise, to start with, is to form a single-member LLC. A single-member LLC is a great step function out of sole proprietorship into an actual entity. Now, just because you form an entity doesn't mean you've got all the protections of an entity. There are a couple things that are really critical here. One is you've got to have an operating agreement which dictates the terms and conditions and operations of that entity. Now, if you're thinking, well, why do I need an agreement to tell me what to do in my entity? Well, the operating agreement isn't so much for you, it would be for other people that might have to step in and run business functions in the event of a disability or a death, right? The operating agreement will have the rules that say what needs to happen in some very foreseeable possible circumstances. So don't just go file something online with the state because you may be missing a critical document called the operating agreement, which will dictate a lot of this stuff that's important. All right, so now let's look at maybe another one. So let's say that it's more than just you. Well, if it's more than just you, then you're going to get into what's called the multiple member LLC space, right? There's some partnership agreements, all kinds of things here. This is if it's more than just you. Now, an operating agreement was critical as a single member LLC. It's really viable with a multiple member LLC because what happens if there's a deadlock? Who's going to make the decisions if you guys don't agree? What happens if the partnership needs to end? And how is that all working? What if the business needs money? All of that is dictated in a multiple member LLC operating agreement. Another good reason to make sure you're working with an attorney to draw up all the documentation. Now, for most small businesses, either a single member LLC or a multi-member LLC configuration is going to do just fine. Some people, though, need to move to more sophisticated structures, corporate structures which actually start to turn it from members, which are LLCs, to shareholders. Why would you need a corporate structure? Well, corporate structures are great for large real estate holding companies. They're great for organizations that need to fundraise. They're great for companies that are likely to sell or go public. A lot more complexity associated with corporations. Probably not something you need to do, though. Talk to your attorney to see where you are now and where you're headed and decide if that is a really good structure for you. Now, about now, people say, well, what about this thing I hear a lot called an S-Corp? This is an important distinction. An S-Corp isn't actually an entity type. An S-Corp is an IRS tax filing status that you elect that you can do as a corporation or as an LLC. And so you can see why in this whole world of entity selection, it's important to get a tax advisor in here quickly because there are tax implications based on what kind of entity type that you select, and you need to understand those. And as corporations aren't things that you can sort of slip in and out of. Like there's some rules and regulations around that. And if you don't follow those can have some big implications for you tax-wise. Now, finally, let me say that it's not just about formation of the LLC. You also need to maintain the LLC, and there are things you need to do on an annual basis or every couple years. For example, in the District of Columbia, I need to file a form with the District of Columbia to keep the LLC in good standing. And if the LLC is not in good standing, then I could lose some of that liability protection from the entity. There are other things too, like do you have a minutes book, right? This is an actual company, and you need to take it seriously. Otherwise, you may not be able to rely on the liability protection you were hoping to in the event something happens, if you've been a little bit messy with keeping your LLC. Now, if this is all a little bit overwhelming and you're like, I got a business to run, how am I going to be keeping minute books around here? In a lot of cases, the business attorney that helps you set up the LLC probably has a paralegal or someone who can, with very little cost, just a couple times a year, go in and make sure that your corporate accounting records and so forth are sufficient to keep the LLC active so that in the event of a problem legally, you have it to rely on. So take all of this seriously. Don't get overwhelmed by it. I mean, quite frankly, you need to consult with your business attorney. You need to consult with your CPA, choose an entity type and a tax filing status, and you're on your way. It's not that complicated. The most important thing is to have great advisors that can look at your individual situation, get it going. And then make sure operationally someone is maintaining this based on the requirements in your jurisdiction so that if you need to rely on the entity for some liability protection, you can.